Okay, everyone, good afternoon. My name is Angela Coleman. I'm the General Manager at Conservation Ontario, and I'm delighted this afternoon to join Kenny Lee Chong Man from AMO on this very important information session that we've had a lot of interest in. Before I turn it over to Kenny and I'll give some additional introductory remarks, I just wanted to briefly do a land acknowledgement from where I'm located here today. So first, I just wanted to say that I'd like to begin by acknowledging that although we have guests from across Ontario joining today, we are gathered here on what is known as Turtle Island. Conservation Ontario's office is situated on the traditional territories and treaty lands, including those of the Massasaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabeg, the Williams Treaty First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis Nation. In the spirit of Dish with One Spoon Treaty, under which many of our lands operate, we recognize our responsibility to protect and steward the environment for future generations. And before I take the first few slides of the presentation, I did just want to take a moment to welcome our chair at Conservation Ontario, Chris White. And Chris, did you want to say a few words before we turn it over to Kenny at AMO? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Angela. Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this seminar. I'm Chris White. I'm the mayor of Guelph-Amasa Township, chair of Conservation Ontario and Grand River. And for those who've seen me around, I was chair of Roma a couple of times, and I was on AMO for quite a while. So probably some familiar faces out there in the audience. As we all know, the land use planning and development framework in Ontario has been evolving for some time. And with all these changes, it can be difficult to keep track of who's still doing what in the process. Today, you'll hear from folks from Conservation Ontario and AMO about the roles of Conservation Authorities Ontario's land use planning and development process. You'll hear about recent proposals and decisions which shape how conservation authorities do their work. And as the CA's key partners, you'll also hear about opportunities to work together throughout this process. The need for communication and collaboration between CAs and municipalities is stronger than ever, and this collaboration can help to achieve great things. Both the CAs and municipalities share the goal of creating safe, healthy, and sustainable communities, and I know that our strong partnerships are key to successfully achieving this goal. So welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair White. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kenny for remarks from AMO, please. Thank you, Kenny.
Hey everyone, and thank you for the intro, Angela. And nice to meet you, Chris White. I'm Kenny Lee Cheong, man. I'm a newer addition to the AMO Policy Center here, and also to the municipal space. I've been here slightly over 3 months, and I'd say since being here, I can tell land use planning and relationships with conservation authorities are really important areas, and it generates lots of interest. I think just look at the uptake on this webinar, and that's sort of a small testament to it. I'll also say land use planning is not necessarily my area of expertise. I work closely with Spencer Sandor, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. But what we work together, and what we both noticed here that Chris alluded to, is there's just been so much change in the past few years. And since starting, he's also relatively new. We've had to try to look at those changes and the sheer volume of content from EROs and omnibus bills, on top of the other complex policy issues that are happening in the municipal world. It's enough to make your head spin. And so I think it's really great that we can take this time to step back and have this session and share information to help both municipalities and conservation authorities and see what the picture looks like right now, and then remind ourselves that we're in it together. We certainly both share and support the same provincial goals of building houses by 2031. I think we also share a common view, though, that it should happen in a way that thinks beyond 2031, and that's making sure that those new and current communities are complete with a broader view to environmental protection and sustainability for future generations, especially in the context of climate change. And so I'm delighted that the session's happening. I'm also delighted to have this be a joint webinar and be joined with CO who will highlight the changes that have impacted CAs and what it means for them and for municipalities, not just because I think it makes sense to do, because it's also a really great learning opportunity for me here too. So, and I'll pass it over to you, Angela, maybe to start the ball rolling.
Thanks so much, Kenny. And unlike yourself, I think I'm a bit of an old hand at this work. I certainly have been in the municipal side of things and conservation side of things, working directly with municipalities, elected officials, staff, and others on a number of different areas in the land approvals process. And I'm also a lawyer who's worked for different municipalities over the years. And I think that the value, hopefully, to bring to this is sort of having seen a lot of this work over many different years, and the changes and how sometimes things change, and how sometimes some of these things seem to stay the same. So again, to everybody, we're absolutely delighted to have you join this webinar today and to talk about the different changes that we're seeing and what they mean for municipalities as well as conservation authorities. And we hope to address questions towards the end. Some have been submitted in advance of our meeting, and so we do have some to begin with at the beginning of the question period. And if there's something that we can tackle, we're going to, very much do our best to tackle everything in the question queue. But if there's anything that we need to take back and think about, we also endeavor to do that collectively. And we'll continue to do that. And a lot of people on the call will have seen me at different of their council and conservation authority board meetings. And I'm also, always delighted to go out and talk through the challenges people are having on the ground as well. Next slide, please, Nick. So, briefly, Amber and I, the former AMO Amber and I, have done a couple of conservation authority webinars and municipal webinars jointly in the past. Some of the things we talked about in the past really was about, again, different changes to the framework that were happening in land use planning, as well as sort of the different roles and responsibilities that everybody had over the different years. Some of you will recall I've talked before about completion of transition periods, different updates to the Conservation Authorities Act. I'll touch back on some of those today so we can recap where we've been as well as where we're going. But the two new focuses for today's session really are having to do with number 3 and number 4, the new Ontario Regulation 4124, as well as different pieces that Kenny and I will speak to later on Bill 185. Next slide, please. And so, we do have some key messaging. We initially started with having this slide at the end of our deck, but I thought what a great opportunity it is to start with sort of talking about the points we want to make today and starting off with those. So over the years, working at the local level, a lot of what happens at the local level ends up being the true negotiation and the implementation place for all of these different policies and pieces that we have. So I really wanted to, work with AMO on this webinar to really talk about the need to communicate, making sure that we do that in a way that's even stronger and more focused in different ways than we've done before. Why do I think that's important? Well, I think, there's always room in the approvals process to negotiate and make sure that we're doing things in a way that ensures that the submissions that we're receiving are more clear. We've asked up front all of the key questions that we really need answered in the process. But I think, now as we look forward and making sure that we're doing the process improvements that allow us to make sure that development is still happening in a way that's safe, we also have to be more quick and more nimble than we've ever been before. So that absolutely means that we have to have the discussions early, and we have to make sure that from the outset, we're asking the questions appropriately and upfront. And we have to make sure as conservation authorities as well, that where there's more than one conservation authority working with the municipality, that we're working together in a way that makes your processes streamlined. So while I would say we're in a time with a rapidly evolving framework, I think this just means that we need to balance these discussions more than ever. And this is part of that. The discussion we're having here is part of that. we only have really had about 1 week to consider the implications of the past Bill 185. So Kenny and I, as we prepared for this webinar, kind of chuckled and said to ourselves, well, there's no way we're going to purport to be the experts on Bill 185 and what it means exactly for the local planning process. But what we do hope to do is have a strong and robust conversation where we can start to think ahead about some of the potential issues and how we can work together to evolve this messaging to make sure we do the best job possible. Next slide, please. So a little bit about conservation authorities and municipalities and the recent work that we've done. Most of you will recall, if you're a council member or a staff member, that a lot of cost apportioning and different service agreements had to come together. So these cost apportioning and service agreements continue to highlight the priorities that the municipalities and the conservation authorities have at the local level. And I have to say, just anecdotally and briefly, I think that those negotiations really helped conservation authorities and municipalities work together to find what were really important shared priorities that they had. It also set the stage for future relationship work that I think is really important for setting up service expectations, understanding between different organizations, and how we can more effectively work together. Next slide, please. And I won't spend a lot of time on these, but there's 3 different types of agreements. Many of you will be familiar with those, but I did want to make sure that I, re-emphasized on here that there are the category 1 agreements that are generally focused on the things that conservation authorities must provide. Category 2, where we are still negotiating and talking about things that municipalities really desire and want to have going on, continue. And category 3, where there are programs and services that are really advisable under the Act and things that we want to do as a group of municipalities together with a group of conservation authorities or a single conservation authority. Next slide, please. And again, these slides will all be available as has been indicated. So if you want to have those for future reference. But again, briefly, the work that conservation authorities will have ready for the municipalities and will be working to present to you include natural hazard infrastructure and operation plans, ice management plans, if that's a feature that is actually required or is done in a watershed-based resource management strategy that outlines important shared services that are undertaken on a watershed basis, natural hazard asset management plan. So again, thinking natural hazards, a lot of what we'll discuss today, floodplains, different elements of natural hazards, erosion, shoreline issues, etc. Conservation area strategy, those important areas that we have in our community, greatly valued by community members, how we value those, how we manage those, how we make those accessible, as well as a detailed land inventory. So there's lots of opportunities to provide feedback on those. So I encourage you to continue to do that over the remainder of the course of 2024. Next slide, please. And now as we move into the land use planning and development framework, just again reminding people in the land use planning side, the conservation authorities have, sort of 2 primary roles in that. One is a regulatory role and one is a commenting role. The regulatory role really functioned a lot like a process that we have under the Building Code Act. It's a permitting function. It is a function that really talks about what activities you can do, what activities you can do, and it's also applicable law under the Building Code Act. The commenting role has more to do with the Planning Act applications. Certainly have spent a lot of time working in this role over a number of different years. It's about making sure that the Planning Act decisions a municipality makes are consistent, for example, with natural hazard policies that we would find in the provincial planning statement, and that those comments that we're making or those decisions that we're making as municipalities together with conservation authorities conform to those requirements under the provincial plans. And then again, related to source water protection, the conservation authorities do have a very substantive role in terms of assisting with source water protection. And the really, the piece of this that we want to highlight today is that it's very important to understand that the comments that we're providing, under these different pieces of legislation Some pieces have changed and some pieces have not changed. But really, we're going to go into deeper dives in terms of the different ones so that you understand better what's really important here. And the regulatory role really is making sure that we keep people, property, and infrastructure safe and out of the impacts that we would have, for example, in floodplains and other areas. And I know I've got some good photos on that, but we'll touch on different pieces of this. But it really is making sure that we're building communities in a way that's safe and resilient, but also make sure that we don't get those sort of really risky areas, those major risk areas of flood. And I know some municipalities have had significant flooding over the past few years, just really making sure that we get those pieces right and that important role that conservation authorities help serve. Slide, please. And, at any point in time, Kenny, I just want to make sure that as I go through these slides, you didn't have anything extra before we go into the updates to the Conservation Authorities Act. So before I proceed in this part two, a quick question to you, Kenny. Anything you wanted to add on this piece?
Nope, not at this time. I think I'll probably add a couple of comments as we go through some of this section, which I think is going to be a reminder and of interest to municipalities.
Absolutely. So let us go through a few things that we wanted to remind everybody of the course of the different things that have happened and where those things land us today. Now, I know that there's a lot of slides, and my preference would have been to have fewer slides and to have really made sure that I covered this. So I'm going to do both things. I think, though, in order to cover this appropriately, we do have to track the legislative changes we've seen over the past few years. You don't have to remember all of these, that's for sure. Some of them will be parts that have to do with municipalities, and some were very specific to Conservation Authorities Act. But you're familiar with these changes, many of you, but it's really an evolution. And this evolution of change has really started in about 2017. In about 2017, we did see a lot of changes to classifying the work of conservation authorities into different categories, changes around when a permit must be issued, and these instances, for example, will parallel, for example, with the ministry zoning power. So just giving that an example, you have maybe in your own communities ministry zoning orders. However, there were pieces of MZOs that also required complementary Conservation Authority Act permits as well to facilitate that development, as well as some new ministers review and permit abilities that we'll talk about today as well. And, what does it all mean? It really does mean that conservation authorities like municipalities have really been responding to a number of provincially led amendments to our legislation for a period of time now. Now, despite these updates, our focus really does remain on the work that we do at the local level. And that's really why we wanted to have this conversation today, just sort of bringing in some experience and in terms of the work that we're actually doing. And so I've gone through what the mandatory processes were, et cetera. And the new piece that we'll talk about today is the ability for a minister to take over certain pieces of the CA permitting process and what that looks like at a municipal perspective. Next slide, please. Now, Bill 23, it's really still probably top of mind for both conservation authorities and municipalities. And different pieces of this act really made change some of the tests that were required under Conservation Authorities Act decisions. But really on the ground, what this looks like is making sure that most of these things still are in place. And I think that that's the important thing to note, having to do with flooding, having to do with all these pieces, a number of these things are still in place. But, also, um, the discussions we've had about natural heritage, we'll have some of those discussions today as well. Just noting that, we have put in the chat, and we'll put in the chat to remind people that both AMO and Conservation Ontario made significant comments on Bill 23, as did many of your municipalities. And so all of this means that we're really looking at this as a scope and host of legislation that we'll still land on today. Next slide. So one of the, more important things that was in the act was a list of prescribed acts that conservation authorities would no longer be providing a municipally requested information on as it related to um, applications made under the Planning Act. But what it didn't change, and I think that's important, is the mandatory review and commenting services that we make for natural hazards, drinking water source protections, and making sure that decisions under the Planning Act are consistent with provincial natural hazard policies. And so there's a lot of things that you can take away from this, but I think that's what's really key here is to remember that these decisions under the Planning Act still must be consistent with provincial policy. And I think where conservation authorities were, for example, previously providing comments and so forth, there are still some pieces of this work that conservation authorities have a lot of expertise on, and municipalities and conservation authorities are definitely, I find are making innovative ways to share this information or to make sure that the municipalities have access to this information. And I think that is an area where we have to continue to talk. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways from these pieces on mandatory programs and services is that not, these pieces having to do with floodplains, we really haven't seen significant changes on these pieces as they relate to floodplains, nor as they relate to drinking water source protection. And it's really, really important as Bill 185 provides some layering and context to this. We know that municipalities will have a number of challenges and pressures to issue decisions in a manner that's really, really fast and and that also introduces a number of appeal mechanisms. But it's really important, and that's why we want to talk about the relationship piece, is making sure that those properties that come in for review, where they have challenges on the site as it might relate to, for example, flooding, erosion, unstable slopes or soils such as landslides, etc., as well as anything having to do with the municipal drinking water system that may show up in a planning document, that we really encourage not only the staff but the proponents bringing in development applications to make sure that we've canvassed those issues ahead of time. And I know that there's changes to pre-consultation, but there's not going to be changes ultimately in terms of what is required of a completed application. So it's really important for building departments, planning staff, as well as others that are involved in the decision-making process to really understand that while we've got expedited processes and new review processes, we still have the requirements for completed application to make sure that these things are done safely. And that's going to require us having good conversations and having those conversations in a way that's quick, upfront, and make sure everybody understands the common expectations. And with that, Kenny, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Angela. I think, I really like the way you framed that. A lot of the core services and a lot of the core pieces are still there, and those are the really important, critical ones. I'd say that in some of the comments that AMO has submitted back to the province, I think both AMO and I'd say Conservation Ontario both support, yeah, let's make processes easier, right, to kind of achieve these provincial goals. But there has been some disappointment that some of those changes have, I think, added a bit of new responsibilities on municipalities, and especially the ones highlighted where there's still a requirement there, but CAs can't really comment on things like natural heritage. And it is something that we've been advocating for the province to really reconsider, even as recently as Bill 185 comments. Angela and I have talked about this, but this government is they listen to problems that come forward often, and also with data. And so as municipalities plan ahead, and Angela, you touched on this, they should be preparing both their budget and sort of their staff to really build in that review capacity in-house, or whether it's through consultants due to those requirements. If you see that evidence of increased costs or process inefficiencies, then please share it back with especially with AMO. It'll help AMO advocacy by helping us concretely show the province where there may have been sort of changes to the act, to CA Act or Planning Act that misalign with that goal of faster development approvals, especially if we find that it's not really actually expediting things. And it also helps give some evidence to some of our push. And I know there was a question submitted early on this that talks about, how do we plan for these resources? Well, a big part of our push is also just kind of putting back to the province that, these changes were made by the province. And so to the degree that they create those pressures, then the province should be coming forward with some resources or some transition funding to help municipalities out if this is what they want. I'd say on the implementation front, I think municipalities are very good at problem solving. They're practical. And so, to the degree that they can, it may be about really having more conversations, both with each other, linking with other municipalities that have in-house capacity to learn or share resources where possible. And then to Angela's point is, really connecting with local CAs that have a lot of the key information, data and reports or studies that can help build capacity for municipal staff to help them in their new reviewing roles. There are, I guess, innovative ways that even though the commenting can't happen, but there is information that can be shared to really help sort of chart a way through.
Yeah, I think that's great, Kenny. And again, just having been on the development review side for a long time, it really is about making sure that staff are enabled to have the conversations they need to have to make sure that pre-consultation, especially, where pre-consultation is being encouraged, really making sure that we're able to um, have the information we need, make sure proponents have the information they need, make sure that they have, for example, the best available data for that property that is available, and really making sure that happens in a way that involves all the parties up front, so that we don't have misunderstanding, miscommunication, and later down the process, any type of errors that could have very easily been avoided if we just would have had the channels of communication open earlier. So that's the most important thing I've seen, in terms of successful development review files over the years. Is one part of it is the quality of the quality of the information we receive for review, and the second part of it is really making sure that everybody understands what those expectations are early in the process and keep talking throughout. So on to the next slide, we'll move into quickly some of the pieces having to do with CA permitting changes that have taken place. Now, again, these are also just in effect as of April 1st of 2024. So again, keep in mind that the reason we're having this discussion is not to give you the be all and end all of these issues, but simply to do some proactive issues identifications so that on the local level, we can be prepared when we see this and help us recognize when we're seeing this, what we're actually seeing. So you can watch this webinar again or think back to it maybe when these issues come to your council tables or Conservation Authority board tables. But I wanted to cover these over in a short few slides here. So, I really want to talk about this for a few different reasons. Anytime I make a submission to people, I say, look, I'm also the person, I'm not, just an idealist in this area. I'm also the person that has gone out on the ground with municipalities, not in this particular circumstance. This is just an example photo. But I've been on the ground for floods. I've been on the ground for challenges with drinking water systems. I'm the person that actually people call and have worked with municipalities and conservation authorities when things actually do go wrong. So I know that sometimes things actually do go wrong. And so I've asked Nick, just to put a few different pieces up. The other thing I wanted to say is I think Conservation Ontario, certainly, and conservation authorities and municipalities, I've said this over and over again, I don't think that any of us are actually opposed to process improvements. We want to see process improvements, and we want to make sure that we're working most effectively as possible. We want to make sure landowners get the decisions that they need in a timely fashion, and we want to be able to do that in a way that's as effective and efficient as possible. But there is a reason that we're doing this work. And so I did want to put a few pictures up behind me as I made this conversation. But this really is about minimizing, insurable losses, uninsurable losses, damage to people and property and so forth. And the work that we're doing is to avoid having, municipalities and others, municipalities, property owners and others facing challenges like this. So there are a number of new exemptions under the Conservation Authorities Act, and I will go through a few of those on permitting. And Nick, if I could have the next slide, please. Um, there's a few considerations, right? And so I put a few slides up just, to sort of highlight the types of challenges where we're permitting. And these are not, just worst case scenarios. These are things that happen along our shorelines. And these are things that we're seeing more frequently happen along shorelines, particularly as we have different storm surges, different, high rainfall, et cetera, in different areas across the province of Ontario. And it's also work that I'm heavily involved with at the not only the provincial level, but the federal level as well, as we have these discussions about making sure that these types of losses are still going to be insurable losses for number one, the homeowner, for number two, the municipality and others if we make these types of decisions. And so very, very important to note where there are exemptions, what is happening as we look at these types of decisions that happened in areas like floodplains. Um, I won't go over the federal trends in this area or the federal concerns, but suffice it to say that there is an overriding concern from insurance and others that if we don't make good decisions today, there's a greater chance that those decisions won't be insurable in the future. And I think that overall is very important as we consider, yes, process improvements, but at the same time, we don't want to be sacrificing public safety at the local level to do that. So building permits, of course, the Conservation Authority Act and its associated regulations are applicable law under the building code. And of course, we talked about the need for pre-consultation. But, the purpose of today's webinar is just to note, as things move quickly, we do need to be really careful to make sure we're not missing these things. And we have fewer of those circumstances, for example, where we have building permits issued in error. But the other thing I really do want to say here is with changes in Bill 185, not as many or not all of the decisions we would have historically seen under the planning framework. There's a number of exemptions now that we're seeing with the implementation of Bill 185. So we need to be thinking collectively about what that means. And again, I'm not here to presuppose that I have all the answers today. We wanted to bring these matters to your attention. Next slide, please. And here, we're talking about the change to the regulation. Not all of these, again, are negative things. As I've said, we are in favor of process improvements, and we do want to make sure we're doing everything we can to commit to this. We have a single regulation now for all conservation authorities. We're working with the ministry and others to make sure that there's not inadvertent consequences to how we view floodplains in certain areas or certain storms. We're working through that, having good conversations on that. Also, those details for prohibited activities. We have to make sure we've got a few exemptions. We don't know exactly what those exceptions look like in all circumstances and what, if any, implications we're seeing on those. But we, collectively, I think, owe it to ourselves to think about some of these and to think about if they create for us a way that we need to probably look at them and report back and say, look, here's some things that we're seeing as perhaps unintended consequences. The Conservation Authority's mapping is under part of the OREG is to be part of the public record and making sure that it's available for review. And I know that conservation authorities and municipalities are working together to make sure that those process improvements happen. And then regulated areas, making sure that all wetlands have a 30-meter buffer included on them. And so some of these protections are actually good in some areas of the province as well. And we also have here different challenges, including the requirements for pre-consultation and making sure that those are aligned with the municipal pre-consultation process as well. And Kenny, did you have any comments on this one, or do you want me to keep going for a while?
I think maybe I'll just reiterate some of the points, but on the sort of the cap size, because I think there's sort of just a municipal implication here around the way forward is that there are these changes, and I think we share the common outlook that we want to avoid risks, right? I don't think we want to sacrifice that for speed. And so now more than ever, because of these changes, I think we just need to sort of make sure that planning processes are carefully assessing and ensuring planning is up to date, right? And gathering information like updated mapping from CAs or having staff dialogues, even sort of CBOs, knowing like what those changes and what is no longer is exempted permitting is to help avoid development activities in those hazard areas. I think the last thing anyone wants is development that results in damage to property and health. And the way through that is making sure that we share updated information with each other to mitigate it, right?
That's super. Thanks so much, Kenny. Next slide, please. I think we may have missed one, but that's okay. Again, this is on this particular slide is to highlight a couple of things. Again, we're just starting this a week after. I think we're actually 1 week to the day after Bill 185. But the change to the Conservation Authority's regulation actually requires the Conservation Authority to provide a pre-submission consultation, which we actually think is a good thing and a best practice. But you might note that the Bill 185 maybe removes the requirement at this time for the municipality to require it on their side. However, the proponent, I think, can still request it. And I think as a best practice, it really makes a lot of sense to make sure that we keep that piece in the process for as much time and as much ways as we can. Why? Because it results in a complete application submission that's going to be better. And those application submissions can really result in us making sure that the fees are not high and we don't see as many reviews of those different requirements. Next slide. To talk about the exceptions, I think really this is a lot. And again, this is not anything we have full I don't know if we would say we don't have a full assessment of it. That's not because we haven't done good work to try to understand it. It's because these things have just come into effect. And so it takes time in some way to really see this and see what the trends are. But again, I don't think we can really see the trends if we're not looking for them. So the importance of this is really to talk about some of these pieces and again, make sure that we're working to the greatest of our ability to make sure that we don't have development activities happening that will not receive a review or a permit from a conservation authority that really require it. And I do want to give an example in this one, and I hope that I do it justice. But one example of an exception under the regulation is right now that the reconstruction of a non-habitable garage with no basement, so stay with me, a non-habitable garage with no basement, if that reconstruction does not exceed the existing footprint of the garage and does not allow for a change in the potential use of the garage, so that is, for example, to create like habitable space or a space where somebody could live, the CA, just so you know, under the change to our act would no longer, for example, be looking at applications for these works, and we're not providing a review of the potential hazard. I think that that's really important because it's a policy change that has been made in the view of streamlining or in a view. But it does create a potential for future loss if those things happen in a floodplain. And the question of whether those losses would or would be insurable is also a question, I think. That would be an individual assessment. So again, another example, I'll give you another example. Construction, you can follow me again on a Friday afternoon. I appreciate your indulgence on this. Construction, reconstruction, or placement of a non-habitable accessory structure that is incidental or subordinate to the principal structure, is 15 meters squared or less, and is not within a wetland or a water course. Well, it sounds like that might capture all kinds of considerations within the footprint exception for sheds and others under the Ontario Building Code. However, these exemptions would allow such structures to be placed within potentially hazardous areas. And I think that we really do um, need to understand that sometimes those types of structures are also converted into, for example, habitable space, or even if that's only done temporarily in a housing shortage, we really do need to make sure that municipal planning controls are in place to manage the impacts of some of these. And again, this is not the be all and end all. This is just a beginning analysis on those. And so I think as we see these, it's incumbent upon us to have discussions to make sure that we're understanding these as we see them. So, and I think with this, Kenny, did you want to make any comments on this one or the drainage one next?
No, just the drainage was next.
Okay,
I think I shared the message in terms of why
awesome.
it's really important that municipalities sort of understand some of these things. And I agree, it is this, they're new. So you have to sort of work your way through and understand how that impact's going to unfold. But
Yes.
it's always better to have the conversation up front than to just wait for the impact to
Yeah.
happen. And
Yeah.
so yeah, being
Yeah.
proactive in that space is kind of the takeaway, right?
Yes, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time as well, so I'll try to speed up a bit. But the reason I kind of try and speak slowly and carefully is because it takes a little bit to understand some of these scenarios. And if you do want to chat in more detail about any of these, do reach out to the Conservation Authority office that's local to you, and or Conservation Ontario, and we can help facilitate that as well. There are a number of exceptions under the drainage work as well. The drainage works here, the thing I think that's important to underscore is that the Drainage Act and the Conservation Authorities Act protocol, or the DART protocol, for those of you who are familiar with the acronym, really does establish a streamlined permitting and approvals process for maintenance and repair works on those municipal drains when they're outside of a regulated wetland limit. So there are some new exceptions, which means those works don't necessarily require a CA review so long as they're undertaken in accordance with what is provided within the DART protocol. But this protocol or this understanding really has set out a good framework to have good communication between municipal drainage supers and conservation authorities. I should say superintendents. I'm speaking in my own slang, but superintendents. So I think again, just we're going to keep in contact with the drainage superintendents of Ontario. We're currently um, you know, where we're not reviewing the works and not charging a fee if they're undertaken with respect to the protocol. But just again to note, if those works, those drainage works are in a regulated wetland feature, a permit is still required. And so again, just making sure that we keep in touch on these points, because I think the quick and cursory would be like viewing this as seeing an exception, but there are still a lot of areas where the permits are required, and just making sure that we don't overlook those areas so we don't get into future situations. Again, we'll keep in touch with the drainage superintendents and the drainage superintendents of Ontario on this. So next slide, please. More to come. And then, all this to say that the updates to the CA permitting framework have left some areas where our municipal partners will want to make sure that they have, some extra care in the planning process to make sure that the development occurs in a way that is responsible and directed away from areas that are at risk of flooding. But we're still here and we're still doing all of the work that you'd normally expect us to do, but there are exceptions, and I think we really have to know what the exceptions are And it may be proactive for a certain period of time to just keep those relationships open and keep those channels of communication open as well, because certain of those ancillary structures, in my view, have the potential for future, future potential municipal liability for their placement in floodplain or near floodplain areas. And like I said, most of the things you don't see the exceptions for. A normal review, normal review process is in place for normal permitting works. Just when you start seeing sheds exempt, different pieces of small ancillary structures exempt, I think we always have to recognize the potential for conversion of those structures into, again, like we said, whether it's living space, whether it's space that's being used for things that we don't know about or didn't intend when we did the initial look through. So just, I think, being proactive and knowing that there's certain exemptions that are within those floodplain areas that have the potential for risk or the potential to find themselves in the water course, really, really important to know about. So over to you, Kenny.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same takeaway, really. Like that the only way through is going to be both. I think there's probably a role to play here in better communicating and sending out what those changes are. And I think we've been talking at least with ministry staff to be like, hey, is there, and I think some of our organizations can play a role in this too, so that that information gets to some of the right offices in the municipal world too, so that there's just an awareness. I think that's the start, right? It's making sure that people are aware of them. And we don't have time to go through all the list here, but having it go to the right people is probably the big piece. And then in terms of how that operates on the ground, it is very much working through and knowing that that is going to be a sort of a spot that is a bit of a new blind spot, right, for municipalities. And so the only way to kind of fill that gap is to better understand and think through and have conversations with CAs to sort of better understand it, to what degree what those risks could start to look like, so that
Yeah.
they can make informed decisions, right?
Yeah, thanks for that, Kenny. And again, I think, if I didn't score it enough too, just tracking those two, because we're not going to be able to influence policy decisions if it goes into each our um, individual municipalities or individual conservation authorities, to keep the dialogue open on how many of these structures we're seeing, what impacts they are having, et cetera, et cetera. And we're not going to even know all those things, right, until uh, when we place a structure in the floodplain, it's usually on a fair weather day, right? No one places their nice new shed in the floodplain thinking that their exempted shed in the floodplain thinking that it necessarily has the potential to be swept away in high floodwaters. And so it takes a while to see the implications of this. And I just want to restate, in no way are we against streamlining where it makes good sense, but we are, we do have to keep our eye on streamlining that has the potential to create future risk and liability. So if we move to the next slide, we'll transition quickly to the final part of our webinar today before we go to questions. And on a Friday afternoon, we really do want to keep this short. So in the final part of our presentation, Kenny and I are going to look at some additional recent provincial proposals and decisions and discuss how they're shaping local roles in land use planning. And as we near the end of the session, I'm going to encourage you to continue placing your questions into the question and answer at the bottom of the screen. And you can also upvote questions if you'd like to see them answered. And we're going to do our best to get to all of those today. So, a few things in this piece here. The new amendments and considering, continuing under the theme of CA permitting in Bill 229, we do have some new comments that both Conservation Ontario and AMO submitted earlier in the month of May. And the comments we were submitting were commenting specifically on some new abilities that the Minister of Natural Resources has. So the Minister of Natural Resources, at this point in time has the ability has a new ability, I should say. It's a new ability to issue an order that would either, do a few different things that I've listed on the slide. And so there's two really important categories here. One is a minister's review of the requirements, for example, that a conservation authority or a local board of directors of a conservation authority would put on a permit. And one is actually a minister's permit that allows two different things to happen here. This is, in my view, a lot like the ability of, the ability to issue, for example, something that looks a little bit like a minister's zoning order. Now, it's not the same. It's not the same at all in that it's not a minister's zoning order, but it is the ability of the minister to assume the role that would normally take place through the local process. And, it's really going to be important to see that the local process doesn't have a number of steps where there could be some bias introduced into the process. And so I do want to go to the next slide, please, and show you why that's a concern or a question that I have. Um, the proposed regulation, for example, when the minister is doing a permit and review, um, requests that the minister's involvement includes whether or not, and this again, you'll see this as a familiarity from the process of a minister's zoning order in terms of process, indication of whether a local municipality has endorsed the project and the request for the minister's involvement. I think that again, there is nothing on the docket to suggest that this is going to be used in but for the most crucial of circumstances where the minister is really looking to expedite an important decision. But I do think this is really important for us to keep an eye on because where we're going to have a decision that would otherwise permit development in potentially a floodplain where the conservation authority would recommend and the conservation authority board may recommend that development not proceed. I think we would really want to be careful in terms of thinking about supporting that with a municipal resolution where at the end of the day, the technical information, we would really have to gather it and look at it and see what it's saying. So I really do think we need to look at this from a watershed lens, and we really do need to think about how this has the potential to impact as well upstream and downstream municipalities, upstream and downstream landowners. And I think what I'm saying is I do think this is has a potential for liability from a number of angles. And with that, Kenny, do you want to say anything about this one?
Yeah, I think that was a great uh, sort of insight into, I think, some of the concerns that were also laid out in our letter to and our comments back. And so that this was a component of the proposal that I had flagged. And like Angela said, one of the risks here is that, if you have a CA that can't really support the permit or an MRF steps in, but it, maybe isn't supported by good planning, you may end up, and then you have sort of this provision that has explicit municipal support, like a letter of a proponent's project. You may introduce some exposure to liability for municipalities, and if there's any unforeseen impacts, as Angela outlined, in terms of potential risks downstream. And so that we've really asked for it to be clear that municipalities be indemnified if decisions are made with the scope of the minister's authority in our comments. And I think the sort of the tie back that Angela made to sort of, there's some parallels here with MZOs and the use of them that's been seen. And so I think there's some caution there. And those minister decisions sometimes are made and they can take accountability at the time of the decision, but it happens within municipalities or CA areas, and the problems sometimes with development often arise like later. And so well after the controversial decision has died down. I'd say, that for some of those reasons, I think we saw this as a bit of a risk. Uh, this covers into a bit of the sort of the wrap up on the next slide, but I think right now it remains to be seen what the ministry will do as a next step. They've heard from both of us here that we're asking for a pause and a discussion on scoping this regulation. We're hopeful that they're going to be open to dialogue here before moving ahead with finalizing a reg, especially better articulating what their intent is and trying to scope it well. But if they do choose to move ahead, especially with the provisions noting that proponents need to submit whether they have municipal support in their petitions, I think it would be the advice would be to really speak with your CAs, planning offices, and other municipalities that are in the watershed if needed, and ensure that the project can be supported from a planning and natural hazard perspective ahead of issuing any support for proponents.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. And again, we want to really be clear today too. We're not being overly critical of this approach. We just want to identify it as what the legislation says. And even today, we can't provide one negative example. We do expect that the minister hopefully will have good discussions with us about making sure that this is done in an appropriate way. So now it's just the fact that, a municipality as of right now at any time could receive such a request. So just really important to be aware of. And with the magnitude of change we're seeing, really important to just, sort of highlight, hey, this may come across your desk and these might be some things to consider if you so wish. Next slide, please. And I think that we're good on this particular slide. I think really what's important, important on the key messaging that we're giving you today is that, we really don't want to have we don't really want we really want to make sure that we're using these decision-making frameworks to support development that's going to be safe development. If we require more information, that we get more information. And I think Kenny and I spoke at Edom about all of the different pieces of this where, we sort of put our thoughts together in a clear way. But again, I think with this particular slide, Kenny nor I on either of these topics purport to be the ultimate expert. And particularly, Kenny, as I turn it over to you, I do it with all the generosity to say we've only had a week. So, Kenny, over to you on this one here to talk a little bit about Bill 185 and making sure we stay in good conversation for this one.
All right, thank you for that generous tee up. This is where I'm going to be a cheap version of my colleague Spencer, who has so much more depth on this. So I hope I do him justice. So some of the points are here. That Bill 185 did receive royal assent on June 6th after receiving some amendments from standing committee, and both CO and AMO submitted letters to standing committee, and I believe Nick might provide some of those links in the chat. It covered a lot of ground. I'd say sort of Bill 185 walked back some of the changes from Bill 23. Notably, it reversed some of the development charges changes from Bill 23. But it also introduced a suite of new changes, including amendments to the Planning Act. And we aren't really going to cover the whole bill because it was patchy and it's a bit of a long piece, but we did want to just highlight some of those changes which potentially have an impact on shared conservation authorities and municipal interests. And so you'll see them here in those green boxes. And one we talked about already, which was pre-consultation. So this one, but the change was it removed the ability for municipal councils to make pre-submission consultations mandatory. And maybe just to reinforce, I think there's real value in pre-consultations as a good planning principle. It creates that checks and balances up front. When you don't have that pre-consultation in place, you may sort of run into a situation where a CA isn't engaged early, and especially if you have a sort of a complex project, they can't provide their feedback until commenting stages or once a CA permit is required. And then I think it makes it more efficient and it makes for better application if you can kind of still continue to encourage that step. I guess I think of this, sort of in simpler terms as, it's akin to a lot of the service delivery improvements that you've seen in provincial programs where, there's a screener, so you get all your ducks in a row earlier on. You know where the situation, you know what your situation is. You can advise on what you need to submit, what to expect and when. And that step makes really sort of a better application overall and avoids, time and money later for you having to come back often to the service desks. And so to me, I think that's uh, taking it away or taking the ability to sort of make that mandatory. I think where there was some concern there, and so in the vacuum of that space, I think it's really incumbent on municipalities to encourage it still as a good practice going forward. Um, the other pieces can kind of be bundled together. It's really around expediting approvals for certain projects. So I think around additional residential units, university student housing, and paving the way for more community service facilities later. And so the ones that are sort of more live, it's public universities planning student housing are no longer subject to planning processes. And the minister will have regulation making authority to remove zoning barriers that discourage owners from building additional units in certain types of houses. And so I think the insider takeaway here is that bypassing, some of the planning processes for these types of developments or proponents, they may present some risks, right, in terms of placement in hazardous areas, given they no longer have to abide by zoning. And there's a process in provincial policy statement policies for a reason, right? So having certain entities or projects skip some of the planning phases has the potential for disagreements or puts pressure later on at the CA or building permit stage for some of these proposals. And then from a municipal planning perspective, kind of creating different planning regimes for types of activity makes it really challenging to coherently plan. An example we've heard when we were sort of collecting comments, and this is really more for illustrative purposes, is like thinking about a university residence in a commercial zone like an industrial strip mall where there isn't really the right infrastructure or limited transit that supports student housing. And so I think the changes here, they create a bit more fracture and patchwork in the planning for municipalities and CAs. And so some of the themes that that I think we shared back in comments reflect some of those concerns, which are on the next slide.
So Kenny, I'm going to give you a little bit of leeway on this. I know we're kind of like getting over time, so I'm going to pass it over to you and we'll all just come in at the close.
Yeah, I think I'd say the pieces speak for themselves here. So I'm going to try to summarize real quick because I do want to open up some time for questions and answers. I think it's a lot of our concerns were around just making sure that keeping people in development safe is up front, having the right tools to do the job, especially around sort of taking away the pre-submission consultation or sort of follow throughs or carryovers from Bill 23, where we're still sort of not getting the right experts to look at the right things at the right time. I think those are things that we still want to see and encourage. Respect for local decision making, especially around MZOs and this isn't necessarily Bill at 185, but it's sort of a culmination of a lot of those changes in respect to some of those issues we laid out for the Minister of MNRF to be able to issue permits now and move CAs. And just recognizing that as and when you sort of fracture and introduce all of these entities into the planning approval process, like it requires so much more collaboration to get it right. And so that is kind of the big takeaway is as you fracture, like the need for more information sharing, the need for more integrated planning is really integral.
And I guess the good news is on this slide that there are some positive changes in some of the policy documents as well. And, we really wanted to, focus on those and watershed planning, there's a lot of reference to that in the proposed provincial policy statement. So we do see that integration. We see the continued recognition of natural hazards, and we see that continued vision. So it's all about us just making sure that at the local level, we continue to figure out the best ways to do that.
All right, and Angela alluded to this, but I get to bookend what we started the presentation with, which is the major theme here is that we need to communicate and collaborate And that need is stronger than ever for CAs and municipalities. That period of change has been intense, and there's probably going to be more change coming up. And so much more has changed around other areas. And I think the best way through is following through on conversations like this, but at a local level, right? And so picking up the phone and chatting with each other, exploring opportunities to share resources to support each other's goals, getting involved with each other's pre-consultations in other areas. It's going to take a lot of coordination because there may be a lot of bodies that are involved in that, but it's really important because, you know, at the end of the day, I think we both share the common vision that we want to create safe and healthy and sustainable communities. And in order to do that under the changes to the planning framework and processes, it requires a lot of discourse and dialogue.
Yeah, thanks, Kenny. And then I think we're just moving to the last slide. And we've got some upcoming events, and I will let Kenny speak to some of those at the upcoming AMO conference. But again, to bring the lens back to this, the effective relationships that conservation authorities and municipalities have had over, in many cases, over 75 years, really are what I've seen at the both the national and international level, a lot of what's allowed us to minimize the damage to property that a lot of areas such as British Columbia and other areas across Canada have seen with recent floods. So all the more reason to stay in contact. And with that, and on a Friday afternoon, over to you, Kenny, for a quick pitch for the AMO session in August.
Yeah, now's the time that I get to plug a future session, which is great. Big conference in August. It's being hosted by Ottawa, August 8th to the 21st. It's the 125th anniversary, and it's going to be a great opportunity to continue this conversation, actually. We have, I think, what I think is an awesome concurrent session planned on this topic, and we'll go over some of the changes that have shifted roles between municipalities and CAs. But you'll get some great speakers from a conservation authority and a municipality that are going to provide some case studies to illustrate like how they've collaborated and some real sort of best practices, lived experiences, and real world examples. I don't know if I can share all the details yet, as it's not up on the site, and some of our conference planning folks may slap my wrist on it. But it will be a good session, so hopefully you can make it. Angela and I will also be there. I think I can share that. So hopefully that's also another reason to come out and check it out. And you can find more details on the AMO website on conference information that's updated periodically as our conference teaming plan finalizes details.